Title: Echoes in the Trees. Chapter 1. The Echoes of the Woods. The air was thick, impossibly heavy, as Kyle ventured deeper into the woods. It clung to his skin like cobwebs, cold and oppressive, yet invisible, a force that seemed to push him forward, urging him towards something he could not name. The trees towered above him, their skeletal branches knotted together in a web that blocked the sky, trapping the sun's weak light like a dying ember. The forest, ancient and unwelcoming, seemed to hum with life, but not the kind Kyle was familiar with. There was something else in the air, a presence, a malignancy that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Kyle paused, trying to steady his breath. His boots crunched on the leaf-covered ground, but even the noise seemed wrong somehow. The forest didn't acknowledge him. It swallowed the sound as if he were a ghost. And perhaps, in a sense, he was. The whispering had started before he entered the woods. It was faint at first, the murmurs barely audible over the sound of his breath and the distant call of a bird. But they grew louder as he walked, curling around him like invisible tendrils. Now, in the heart of the forest, they were impossible to ignore. It wasn't human. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking, their ancient voices reaching out to him, beckoning him forward. "Come closer." The voice was faint, a breath on the wind, but it was unmistakable. He stopped, heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced, trying to convince himself it was nothing. The wind, a trick of the light, maybe even his imagination. He was alone out here. Nothing could hurt him. The woods were quiet. Old, yes, but safe. A flicker of movement caught his eye, and Kyle whirled around. Nothing. The trees stood unmoving, their gnarled trunks like sentinels, watching him from every angle. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. "Come closer," the voice repeated, this time closer, clearer, like a whisper in his ear. Kyle's throat tightened. He wasn't alone. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to run, but he fought it. He had been hunting for years. He was a seasoned outdoorsman, prepared for any eventuality. The voice was just a trick of the mind, a combination of isolation and exhaustion. He'd pushed too far into the forest today. His mind was playing tricks on him. He took a cautious step forward, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. The path ahead twisted, narrowing between two enormous oaks, their branches stretching overhead like a natural tunnel. The air grew colder still, the earth beneath his feet damp, the smell of decaying leaves thick in his nostrils. The further he went, the darker it became, as if the trees themselves conspired to blot out the light. Suddenly, a rustling noise shattered the stillness, a harsh grinding sound, like something large dragging itself across the ground. Kyle's heart skipped a beat. He spun toward the noise, rifle raised, eyes scanning the underbrush. Nothing. A moment passed. Then another rustle, closer this time. He held his breath, straining to see, but the forest was thick with shadows. His fingers tightened on the rifle's trigger. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. Something was moving. Something just beyond the edge of his vision, just out of reach. "Who's there?" Kyle called out, his voice strong, though his chest felt tight with anxiety. There was no answer, just the persistent whispering, growing louder, almost drowning out his thoughts. He stepped forward again, moving cautiously, his footsteps muted by the thick carpet of leaves. His eyes darted from one shadow to the next, every movement in the corner of his vision, a potential threat. But nothing, no animals, no birds, not even the wind. The silence was suffocating, and every step Kyle took seemed to bring him deeper into its grip. The path ahead narrowed further, until the trees were almost touching, their limbs entwined like skeletal hands reaching for each other. Kyle swallowed hard, stepping carefully between the trees. And then, there it was, a figure. It stood in the middle of the path, just ahead of him, shrouded in darkness. Its shape was impossible to make out at first. No human form, no recognizable animal. It was just there, a blur of movement, a dark silhouette against the blackness of the forest. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. His grip on the rifle tightened. "Who are you?" he called again. his voice trembling now, despite his best efforts to stay calm. The figure did not answer, but the whispers, that constant, unyielding whispering, seemed to emanate from it, pulling at Kyle's mind, feeding on his fear. The creature, or whatever it was, shifted. The shadows surrounding it seemed to warp and move as it did, the darkness itself a part of it. Kyle could see now, in the dim light, something that looked like limbs, too long, too thin, stretching unnaturally toward him. He backed up, his pulse racing. There was no way he was going to engage it, not like this. He turned and ran, his heart hammering, legs pumping furiously as he pushed through the brush, desperate to escape. The whispers, though, didn't stop. They were louder now, swirling around him, filling his head. The trees, the shadows, they were alive with them, alive with a presence that wanted him. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he pushed into the forest, the sound followed him. The rustling, the whispers, the occasional dragging noise that seemed to grow nearer and nearer. His lungs burned as he reached the edge of the trees, the path opening up ahead of him. Relief washed over him in a cold wave. The forest was ending, and he could finally leave it behind. The trail back to the cabin was only a few hundred yards away, but as he stumbled into the clearing, his foot caught on a hidden root, and he fell, hard, onto the cold ground. The rifle skidded from his hands, and he could feel the panic rise in his chest. His breath came in shallow gasps, and he scrambled to get up. That's when he saw it. In the clearing, standing at the edge of the trees, was the figure. It was no longer a blur. He could see it clearly now. It was tall, unnaturally so. Its body was hunched, limbs impossibly long and twisted, skin pale, almost translucent, with veins crawling beneath it like worms in the dirt. Its face was a twisted mess of hollow eyes and jagged teeth, its mouth open in an eternal scream. But the most terrifying part was the eyes, black, endless pits that seemed to look straight into Kyle's soul. He could feel it then, the pressure, like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching him, studying him. The creature didn't move, but Kyle knew it was watching, waiting. Then the whisper returned, louder than before. "You belong to the forest now." Kyle's blood ran cold. His breath hitched in his throat as the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. The trees bent inward, the shadows growing deeper, darker, suffocating him. And then, as if the woods themselves had closed in on him, the figure stepped forward. Chapter 1, Part 2. The Echoes of the Woods. Kyle's heart thudded against his ribs, a steady drumbeat of panic. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on him, the trees looming over him like dark sentinels. The creature before him moved, its limbs stretching and twisting unnaturally as it took a step forward. It didn't walk like a man. It didn't move like any creature he'd ever seen. The way it moved was more like a shadow, stretching and warping with each movement, its body elongating and twisting in ways that defied nature. The whispers grew louder until they were all he could hear. They echoed in his skull, 1,000 voices speaking in unison, a chorus of cold, insistent tones. "You belong here. You cannot leave." They weren't just words. They were like a physical force, pushing against his mind, invading his thoughts. For a moment, Kyle couldn't breathe. His lungs felt like they were being crushed by the weight of the voices, and every muscle in his body was locked in place, frozen by an overwhelming sense of dread. The creature's eyes, those abyssal black pits, seemed to pulse with the whispers, as though they were the source, the beating heart of the forest itself. "Run! Run!" His mind screamed at him, but his body refused to obey. The rifle lay just out of reach, the cold metal glinting faintly in the dim light. He tried to move toward it, but the forest wouldn't let him. His limbs felt heavy, like the very air was thickening around him, pressing him into the earth. The figure took another step closer. Kyle could feel its presence now, an oppressive weight on his chest, as though it was dragging him toward it. The creature's mouth opened, and its voice, deep and gravelly, as though it had not spoken in centuries, ripped through the air. "Join us!" The words were a command, a sentence, a finality. And for a brief, heart-stopping moment, Kyle felt the world slip away from him. His vision blurred, the forest around him becoming a whirl of shadows and faint whispers, and he was drowning in the sound. His hands shot out involuntarily, grasping at the ground, trying to push himself backward. But his fingers could not find purchase on the damp earth, the soil slipping like oil under his touch. His body wouldn't obey him. Suddenly the whispers stopped, and everything went deathly silent. Kyle blinked, his breath ragged, his vision clearing. The creature hadn't moved. It stood still, watching him, its hollow eyes boring into his soul. But there was something else. A shadow, darker than night itself, was beginning to stretch from behind the creature, like an ink stain spreading across the ground. It crept slowly forward, as though it had a mind of its own, the darkness growing until it filled Kyle's vision entirely, and then it lunged. A shock of cold flooded his veins, and for a split second, it felt like the world had collapsed in on him. The shadow enveloped him, dragging him downward, suffocating him. He could feel its presence in his lungs, in his chest, like a suffocating weight pressing against his ribs. His heart raced, each beat pounding in his skull. He tried to scream. He tried to thrash against the weight, but it was as though his body had stopped listening. His limbs were heavy, numb, unresponsive. A voice, deep and guttural, echoed inside his mind. "It is too late for you. You are one of us now." The darkness surrounded him. His thoughts scattered. He could feel the forest itself pulling at him, the trees growing closer, their limbs reaching out to grab him, to claim him. And the whispers, they returned, louder than before, a cacophony of voices blending together, all chanting in unison. One of us, forever, forever. Kyle's breath caught in his throat as the last vestiges of his awareness were swallowed whole by the darkness. The world around him, the trees, the figure, the whispers, they all faded away, replaced by an endless void. He was no longer in the forest. He was no longer in the world he knew. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on the ground, but not where he had fallen. The landscape had changed. The trees were gone. The air was still heavy, thick, but there was no warmth left in it. The world was darker now, as if the sun itself had been swallowed by an eternal twilight. The sky above was bruised and sickly, swirling in shades of grey and black. The wind whispered, but this time, it wasn't just the trees. The sound came from everywhere, as though the very air itself was alive and speaking. Kyle's limbs still felt heavy, but now they obeyed. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his body trembling with the aftershock of whatever had just happened. The world around him seemed unreal, as if it were stitched together by memories he couldn't place, fragmented and shifting. He wasn't sure how long he had been unconscious, but the feeling of something watching him was unmistakable. He could sense the weight of eyes upon him, though when he looked around, there was nothing to see but the endless expanse of grey. The ground beneath him was cold, hard and dry, like the bones of the earth itself. And then he saw it. At first, it was a flicker in the corner of his vision, a shift in the air that made his skin crawl. He turned sharply, and there in the distance was a figure. Its shape was indistinct, blurred, but the closer it came, the clearer it became. It wasn't the creature from before, but it was just as unsettling. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. The figure was tall, gaunt, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it had been trapped in the same moment for far too long. Its face was obscured, covered by a dark, tattered hood, and its hands hung at its sides, long fingers curled like claws. As it drew closer, Kyle felt the air around him grow colder still, the chill creeping into his bones. The figure stopped a few paces away from him, its head tilting ever so slightly, as though examining him, taking his measure. Kyle couldn't move, couldn't speak. The weight of its gaze was unbearable. And then, in a voice that sounded like it had been carried from the depths of the earth itself, the figure spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." The words echoed in Kyle's head, reverberating off the walls of his mind, leaving an imprint so deep it felt like a physical blow. "You don't belong here," the figure repeated, stepping forward. Each movement was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. Kyle took a step back, his mind spinning. What did it mean? Where was he? Was this still the forest? Had he somehow crossed over? Was this some kind of nightmare? But no, the chill in the air, the heavy weight of the whispers, the figure before him. This was real. This was something far worse than a dream. You shouldn't have come, the figure continued, its voice almost gentle now. Now you're part of it, part of the woods. Kyle's eyes widened. The woods? Before he could respond, the world around him seemed to shift again, the grey sky darkening even further, the ground beneath his feet becoming unstable. He tried to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. His chest tightened, the air thick with a sense of foreboding, as though something terrible was about to unfold. And that's when he heard it, a low, guttural growl rising from the earth itself. Chapter 2. The echoing silence. The sky was bruised by the evening light, hanging heavy over the dense forest. It wasn't the kind of place most people would wander into without a reason, and even then, the sense of discomfort in the air was palpable. The trees stood like sentinels, their skeletal branches reaching upward as if to block out the last remnants of sunlight. I was alone, not by choice, but out of necessity. The others had left hours ago, spooked by something none of us could understand, something that lingered just beyond the veil of the normal. They were eager to return to the safety of their cars, the hum of the city, and the mundane comforts of the world they knew, but I, like some moth to a flame, stayed behind. Curiosity had its hold on me. The area was quiet, too quiet. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of birds, squirrels, and rustling leaves, had fallen into a complete and unsettling silence. The birds had ceased their singing, the wind had stopped its usual whistling through the branches, and the usual creaks and cracks of the forest seemed distant, almost muffled. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me, waiting. I kept my eyes focused on the path ahead, the one I had walked countless times before. But tonight, it felt different. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air seemed thicker, heavier, as if something were pressing in on me from all sides. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I quickened my pace, not wanting to give in to the creeping unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the tree stand, the one that had become my refuge in these woods. From this vantage point, I could see everything, the winding trail, the clearing, the thick underbrush, all of it. It was the perfect spot for solitude, away from the prying eyes of others. But tonight, the stand looked different. It was darker, the shadows beneath it deeper. I hadn't noticed before, but something about the structure now seemed wrong. The ladder, usually sturdy and reliable, looked crooked and old, as if it had been left to decay in the elements for far longer than it had. The wooden planks of the stand itself appeared warped, the ropes that held it in place fraying at the edges. I swallowed hard, feeling my pulse quicken. Something had changed. I hesitated, stepping forward, but then I heard it, a soft, distant whisper. At first, it seemed like the wind, a mere trick of the air. But no, it was words, muffled, barely audible, but distinct enough that I could feel their meaning in my chest. The whisper came again, closer this time, and my stomach churned. Help! Me! The voice was faint, desperate, and unmistakably human. My instincts screamed for me to turn around, to run, to leave the forest behind and never look back, but something held me in place, rooted to the ground. Fear, yes, but also an insatiable curiosity, a need to understand what was happening in these woods. The woods that had never felt quite this way before. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one. The forest was as empty as it had been when I arrived, the silence broken only by the faintest whisper that seemed to float on the wind. I reached the tree stand, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. As I began to climb the ladder, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It echoed in my mind, reverberating through my skull like 1,000 voices speaking at once, pulling me upward, urging me toward the unseen. Halfway up the ladder, I froze. A figure had appeared in the clearing below me, standing just beyond the shadows of the trees. It was hard to make out at first, too dark, too far away, but as my eyes adjusted, I could see its shape. A tall figure, unnaturally still, with the outline of what looked like long, spindly limbs stretching out from its body. I couldn't see its face. It stood there, silent and unmoving, watching me with an intensity that sent chills crawling up my spine. And yet it wasn't the figure itself that terrified me. It was the way the forest seemed to shrink around me, how the trees began to bend toward the creature, as if it were somehow pulling the very life from the land. The whispering grew louder still, now merging into a single clear voice, one that seemed to call out to me by name. "Come, closer." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my limbs frozen in place. The forest was alive now, alive in a way I couldn't comprehend. The branches swayed, but there was no wind. The ground beneath me trembled ever so slightly, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for me. I didn't know how much time had passed, but the figure was still there, its presence unnerving in its stillness. I couldn't tear my gaze away from it. It had no face, but somehow, I knew it was looking directly at me. And in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though I had crossed into a world that was no longer my own. Suddenly the figure moved, not a swift motion, but a slow, deliberate movement. It took one step forward, then another, its long limbs dragging behind it as if bound by invisible chains. Each step made no sound, as though the earth itself had forgotten how to make noise when it touched the creature's feet. And then, it was gone. The figure had vanished into the thick shadows of the forest, disappearing into the same darkness from which it had emerged. The trees that had bent toward it now straightened, the pressure lifting from the air as if it had never been there at all. For a moment, everything was still. The whispering ceased, and the forest returned to its normal state of eerie quiet. But it wasn't the same. I wasn't the same. I could feel it in my bones. The knowledge that something was wrong, that something had changed. The trees no longer felt like sentinels guarding a sacred place. They felt like watchers, observing me, judging me, waiting for something that I could neither understand nor explain. I climbed the rest of the way up the ladder, my mind spinning, my heart pounding. The stand creaked beneath me, and I steadied myself, trying to ignore the faint, lingering unease that clung to every fiber of my being. From the safety of the stand, I looked out over the forest. The creature, whatever it was gone. But the forest felt different, unknowable. It felt as if it had become something other than itself, a place where rules didn't apply, where the boundaries between the living and the dead had grown thin. And then, from deep within the trees, I heard the whisper again. But this time, it wasn't calling me. It was laughing, a low, guttural laugh that seemed to echo from all directions. And for the first time, I understood what was truly waiting for me in these woods. It wasn't just a ghost or a spectre. It was something older, something much more ancient, a force that had existed long before humanity ever set foot in these woods. And I was no longer an observer. I was a part of it. Chapter 3. The Whispering Shadows. The night hung heavy in the air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The forest had shifted somehow, as if it had become aware of my presence. It watched me with its vast, empty eyes, the trees stretching like skeletal hands against the pale moonlight. The whispers from the shadows had stopped, but the silence that followed was far worse. It felt as though the woods were holding its breath, waiting, listening. I had thought about leaving, running back to the camp, to the warmth of the fire and the laughter of my friends. But something held me there, a compulsion, a need to understand what I had seen, or thought I had seen. The figure in the clearing, the chilling laughter, the pressure in the air that had almost crushed me. My mind kept replaying it, each detail more vivid and disturbing than the last. As I sat perched in the tree stand, the wind whispered through the branches, sending a shiver down my spine. I clutched the edge of the stand, my knuckles white, as if the very action of holding on would tether me to something real. But in that place, in that moment, nothing felt real anymore. I had convinced myself that the figure was a trick of the light, that I had imagined the movement in the shadows. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever had stood there, watching me, wasn't human. It wasn't something I could explain away. The wind picked up again, and the trees swayed. I looked down at the ground below, watching the shadows stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The forest was alive with the rustling of leaves, but it wasn't the same. The sound was too heavy, as if the very earth was groaning under some immense weight. I wanted to climb down, to escape the oppressive darkness that seemed to close in around me. But I couldn't. There was something in the air now, something that made every instinct in my body scream to stay still, to wait. The voice returned. It came not from the wind, but from somewhere deep in the woods, impossibly distant, and yet too close for comfort. A voice like gravel scraping across stone, low and guttural, barely above a whisper. Come closer. I froze, my blood running cold. The words were unmistakable, their meaning clear. It wasn't calling out to me. It was commanding me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and for a moment, I thought my heart had stopped beating altogether. I knew that voice. I knew it from somewhere, deep in the recesses of my mind, but I couldn't place it. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness beneath the tree stand. There was no movement, no figure in the shadows, yet the voice had spoken again, closer this time. Don't fight it. You can't run from me. A chill ran through me, so cold that I could almost feel it in my bones. I clutched the edge of the stand tighter, willing myself to remain still, but it was getting harder to breathe. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. I glanced up at the moon, its pale light shining down, cutting through the fog that had begun to creep in. The forest was shifting again, the shadows growing deeper, darker. The stillness was overwhelming, like the world was holding its breath. Suddenly, I saw it again. The figure. At first, it was a shape in the corner of my eye, a blur in the darkness. But when I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing. Just the trees. I blinked, and for a split second, I saw it again, this time closer. A tall figure, its limbs impossibly long, draped in shadow, but not quite blending into the darkness. It was there, standing just beyond the reach of the tree stand, its body unnaturally still, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for me. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the wave of panic that threatened to overwhelm me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The figure was moving now, slowly, deliberately. Its limbs stretched and twisted unnaturally, like some kind of insect, its movements jagged and unnatural. I should have climbed down, should have run as fast as I could, but I couldn't. I felt as though I were paralyzed, caught in the gaze of something ancient, something that existed outside of time and reason. The figure took another step forward, and I could see it more clearly now, though I wished I hadn't. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where its head should have been. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt the edges of reality begin to blur. The voice came again, this time clearer, louder. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a command. Come down. I didn't want to obey. I didn't want to look at it. But something in the voice, something in the way it reverberated in my skull, made me start to move. My body, against my will, began to descend the ladder, each step feeling like a slow death, like I was walking towards something I could never escape. As my feet touched the ground, the air grew colder still, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The figure hadn't moved, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me, pushing me toward it. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The forest was no longer just a place of trees and shadows. It had become a living entity, an entity that was aware of me, that knew I was there, and worse, it was calling to me. The figure's movement was slow but relentless, each step drawing it nearer. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat as I stood frozen, unable to tear my gaze away. It reached out, its long, spindly fingers stretching toward me, and as it did, the forest seemed to bend and twist in on itself, the trees leaning toward it like they too were part of its will. A sound broke the stillness, A crack of branches, a low groan from the earth. Something was shifting, something was waking, and then the ground beneath me gave way. The air was thick, suffocating. My body jerked, flailing in the darkness, and I found myself tumbling, falling downward into a chasm I hadn't known existed. The trees around me began to blur into twisted shapes, their forms morphing and stretching into grotesque silhouettes. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, all calling my name. And through it all, I heard one clear, undeniable voice. Welcome home. Chapter 3. The Whispering Shadows, Part 2. The fall seemed endless, a spiraling descent into a darkened void that stretched beyond my comprehension. The forest had vanished, and with it, the world I knew. In that split second before my feet hit the ground, everything seemed to disappear. My thoughts, my fears, my very sense of self. There was no sensation of solid ground beneath me, no feeling of impact, just the cold, oppressive darkness, swallowing me whole. When I landed, it wasn't with the sickening thud I had expected, but with a soft, almost imperceptible hush. I gasped for air, my lungs constricting in panic, the ground beneath me slippery, like wet stone. I stood, trembling, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. The shadows clung to me, as though they too had fallen, surrounding me with their ever-encroaching weight. I tried to blink, to focus, but the darkness was too thick, too heavy. The whispers were still there, now a chorus of low, distorted voices, each one a thread pulling at my sanity, weaving together a tapestry of confusion and dread. Welcome home. The voice was the same, familiar and alien at the same time. It reverberated through my bones, vibrating the very air around me, filling every corner of the place I had fallen into. I staggered forward, my heart racing, a cold sweat prickling on my skin. There was no escape. The sound of the voices, the command in their tone, kept me rooted to the spot, like I had been bound by invisible chains. As I steadied myself, I became aware of the vast emptiness around me. The ground was no longer the familiar soil of the forest, but something foreign, something unnerving. It felt like stone, but not quite. A surface that was both solid and fluid, like I was standing on the edge of a massive living organism. Beneath the surface, I could almost feel something breathing, pulsing. The air was thick, humid, as though I was in some cavernous place deep beneath the earth, or perhaps even somewhere else. I tried to move, to find something that could make sense of this place, but my legs felt heavy. My body drained of energy. The whispers pressed in on me, louder now, their words too distorted to make out clearly, but I could sense the urgency in them, the need to understand, to know. The oppressive sensation of being watched was overwhelming, as if invisible eyes were tracking my every movement. The faintest light flickered ahead, barely visible in the dense darkness, like the last embers of a dying fire. It beckoned me, flickering erratically, as though it were struggling to stay alive. I took a step forward, hesitant but drawn toward it. Each movement felt like a struggle against an unseen force, but something inside me, the primal instinct to survive, to escape, pushed me onward. I pushed through the suffocating gloom, my hand brushing against the smooth, pulsing surface as I walked. The air grew colder the closer I got to the light, and I shuddered involuntarily. The whispering voices were now almost inaudible, drowned out by a deafening silence that pressed in on me, making every step feel like it could be my last. My breath came in shallow gasps as I reached the source of the light. It was a door, a massive arched door, made of some unrecognizable material, its surface etched with symbols that twisted and writhed like living things. The light emanated from the cracks between the door's edges, spilling out in soft golden hues that bathed the surrounding area in an eerie glow. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a heavy, almost tangible stillness. I stood before the door, heart pounding, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn around and run. But my body, my legs, refused to obey. The pull of the door, of whatever was on the other side, was too strong. It was calling to me, in a way that felt ancient, a force beyond my understanding. I could feel it in my bones, in the marrow of my soul. It wanted me to cross the threshold. With trembling hands, I reached for the door's handle. Cold, too cold. It sent a jolt through my body, numbing my fingers. My heart beat faster now, every muscle taut with fear. But I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I turned the handle. The door creaked open, the sound like the groan of some massive ancient creature awakening from a deep slumber. I stepped through, into a space that could not possibly exist. The air was different here, still, suffocating, but thick with a strange magnetic energy. The light, now coming from all directions, was unnaturally bright, but it cast no shadows. There was no warmth to it, just an overwhelming glow that made my eyes ache. I was no longer in the forest. I was somewhere else, somewhere deep, deep beneath the earth, or perhaps in a place that existed between worlds. Ahead of me, a figure stood. It was tall, its form cloaked in shadow, though I could make out the sharp angles of its body. Its head was turned toward me, but its face was hidden in the dark folds of its hood. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker beneath the shadow, a glint of light, or perhaps a pair of eyes. But before I could focus, it moved. It took a step toward me, its feet making no sound on the ground. The silence around us was suffocating, oppressive, but the figure's presence felt like an anchor, a pull that I could not resist. "Why are you here?" The voice was low, reverberating through the air, vibrating the very walls of this strange place. It was not the same voice from before, the one that had been calling me. This voice was different. It felt older, deeper, as though it carried with it the weight of ages. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, constricted. The figure took another step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it were measuring me, studying me. "Do you remember why you came?" it asked. I couldn't answer. I didn't know how to explain the thoughts that churned in my head, the feelings that surged through me, the desire to understand what was happening. I had come here for answers, hadn't I? But answers felt so far away now, slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. The figure took another step closer. It was so near now that I could almost feel its breath, cold and heavy, against my skin. And then I saw it. The face. It wasn't a face, not in any way that I could comprehend. The features were distorted, a swirling mass of shifting shapes and shadows, constantly moving and changing. Eyes that weren't eyes, mouths that weren't mouths, skin that was more like a patchwork of endless layers, each one blending into the next. And in the center of it all, something spoke. It wasn't words, not exactly, but an understanding, a recognition. "You should not have come," it said. Its voice was not heard but felt, deep inside my mind, where it turned everything to ice. "Now you are bound." I didn't understand, but I could feel it, the weight of it, the chains that had wrapped themselves around my heart, my soul, my very existence. Before I could react, the figure reached out. Its hand, long and jagged, like the roots of some ancient tree, closed around my wrist, tightening with an unyielding force. And in that instant, I felt it. The pull, the sinking feeling as the world around me shattered into pieces. I screamed, but no sound came. The last thing I saw was the figure's shifting monstrous face as it closed in on me, swallowing me whole. And then, darkness. Chapter 6. The Abyss. Beneath the darkness was not what it seemed. I had once thought darkness was simply the absence of light, a void that swallowed the world whole. I had been wrong. The shadows here were not just empty spaces between flickering lights. They were alive, breathing, moving like a living organism. The longer I stood in the abyss, the more I felt its pulse, like the heartbeat of a creature too vast to comprehend. It wasn't a mere sensation. It was a physical presence pressing against my skin, crawling up my spine, wrapping itself around my limbs. The air in this place was thick, humid, and seemed to grow denser with each breath. My lungs fought against the pressure, but still, I breathed it in. Cold, damp, unnatural. And then I realized that I wasn't standing on solid ground anymore. At first, I thought I had simply lost my balance. The world seemed to tilt, the ground beneath my feet wavering like a mirage. But then, the sensation intensified. The earth, if it could even be called that, was shifting, undulating beneath me. It wasn't soil or rock. It was something softer, like flesh. The ground was alive, contracting and expanding, pulsing with something far more ancient than I could comprehend. I could feel it beneath my boots, under my skin, moving through my veins. The thought that I might be standing on a living organism sent a jolt of panic through me. But before I could react, the world around me shifted. The shadows in the distance moved. Slowly, like a waking beast, the darkness began to take form. There was a shape in the distance, something tall, obscured by the mist, a figure that I knew deep down I should never have approached. But there I was, drawn to it, as if the void itself was calling to me, urging me to come closer. I moved without thinking, my legs moving of their own accord, carrying me toward the shadow. I could see it now. What had once been an indistinct shape was becoming clearer. It was not a person, not human, nor was it an animal. It was something far older, something primal. Its form was twisted, a grotesque reflection of humanity, with elongated limbs and fingers that reached out like branches from a dead tree. The darkness seemed to writhe around it, as if the creature itself was drawing the shadows into its body, feeding on them. The closer I got, the more it seemed to watch me. I could feel its eyes on me, though I could not see them. It knew I was coming. It was waiting. A voice, distant and low, began to rise from the creature's form. The words were incomprehensible, a string of syllables that didn't belong to any language I recognized. But the meaning was clear. It wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking through me. I stopped, heart pounding, breath caught in my throat. The air was so thick now that it felt like I was breathing through wet cloth. The creature was getting closer, and the weight of its presence was suffocating. My body felt heavy, as though the air itself was pressing down on me, crushing the breath from my lungs. Suddenly, everything froze. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but time had ceased to exist. The creature had not moved. It merely stood there, watching, waiting. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing in the back of my mind, scraping against the walls of my consciousness. I could hear them now, clear and insistent. You are already ours. I tried to scream, but the words were strangled in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the fear that had gripped me, that terrible, suffocating fear. And then, I felt something, a pressure on my chest, a cold, solid force, like a hand reaching into my ribcage, grasping my heart, squeezing it until I couldn't breathe. I was being pulled toward the creature, dragged into its grasp. But no matter how hard I fought, how hard I tried to break free, I couldn't. The shadows closed in, wrapping themselves around me like tendrils, pulling me closer to the figure. It was almost as if the darkness had a mind of its own, a will that controlled everything in this place. The creature reached out, its fingers elongated, clawed, like a spider's legs. It was coming for me. In that moment, I knew I had no escape. I had walked too far into the void. The abyss had already claimed me. Suddenly, there was a violent jolt, and the darkness around me twisted violently, like a rip in fabric, pulling me in all directions at once. A bright light flared from the center of the room, too brilliant to look at. I was thrown backward, my body slammed into the unseen surface behind me. My head hit the ground with a sickening thud. The whispers faded. The cold grip on my chest loosened. I gasped for breath, my vision blurred as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I had been pulled away, but not to safety. The light had come from nowhere, blinding, and it had torn the darkness apart. But I had no idea where it had sent me. I pushed myself to my feet, disoriented and weak. The light had dimmed, leaving only a faint glow in the distance. I didn't dare look back. Every part of me screamed to leave, to run, but the path ahead seemed just as uncertain. The whispers had returned, soft and faint, like the wind rustling through the trees. But they weren't the same whispers from before. These were different, more personal. You can't run. I froze. The voice wasn't from the shadows or the creature. It was a voice I knew. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. It was her, the woman from my dreams, the one who had called me here. Her figure appeared in the dim light, her face pale, eyes hollow with something I couldn't place, but she was no longer standing at a distance. She was right there, in front of me, her hand outstretched, her fingers twisted. "You're already too far gone." Her voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was an underlying horror in it that made my skin crawl. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. "You never should have followed the whispers," she continued. "This place, this abyss, is where you belong now." Her lips curled into a twisted smile. "The only way out is through, but that's not something you'll ever want." I backed away, stumbling, but no matter how far I retreated, she was always there, standing just out of reach. The ground shifted beneath my feet again, the pulse of the dark abyss continuing its relentless beat. The whispers grew louder, drowning out the sound of my own thoughts. I was trapped in a nightmare that I could never escape. The shadows, the whispers, the woman, they were all part of this endless, suffocating prison. I had entered a place where time had no meaning, where reality itself was warped, twisted beyond recognition. And I knew, deep down, that there was no way out. But even in the darkest corners of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder, was I the only one who had fallen? Had anyone else come before me? Or was I truly alone in this nightmarish world? Chapter 4. The Descent into Silence. The quiet was unbearable. I had come to understand the silence as something far more insidious than the absence of sound. It was a weight, pressing down on my chest, closing my throat. It was the kind of silence that drowns you, that makes you feel like the very air itself is conspiring against you. The longer I stayed here, the more it began to suffocate me. The silence in this place was not just the absence of noise. It was a living entity, a parasite that latched onto your mind, devouring your thoughts, your memories, your sense of self. It gnawed at me from within, like something crawling under my skin. I couldn't remember how long I had been standing in this strange, timeless expanse. The ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, as though the earth itself was alive. There was no sense of direction, no way to tell where I had come from or where I was supposed to go. The walls of mist that surrounded me seemed to pulse with a hidden life of their own, and the faint light that filtered through it only served to make the shadows deeper, more menacing. And then there was the sensation, the strange, unsettling sensation of being watched. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, a presence lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation twisting my perception of reality. But it didn't take long for me to realize that I wasn't imagining it. The sensation grew stronger with each passing moment, like something, or someone, was moving just out of my sight, lurking just beyond the veil of mist. My breath quickened. I tried to move, to force my body to take action, but my legs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. The fear was paralyzing. I couldn't move forward. I couldn't move backward. I was trapped in this silent, suffocating world with something that was following me, watching me. And then there was the sound, a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It didn't come from the direction I had been looking, but from somewhere behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, no figure, no shape in the mist. Just the same oppressive silence, broken only by the soft rustle of something moving in the distance. My mind raced. What was it? Was it the same thing I had seen earlier, the shadow in the distance, or was it something else entirely? My heart hammered in my chest, the fear coursing through me like an electric current, but I couldn't stop myself from moving toward the sound. I took a step, then another, the air growing heavier with each movement. It felt like I was walking through molasses, my body weighed down by something I couldn't see. The whispers grew louder, but still I could not make out the words. They were foreign, twisted, like the voices of people long dead, their souls trapped in this place with me. I kept moving, driven by some primal instinct I couldn't understand. I had to find the source of the sound. I had to know what was watching me, and then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the mist, like a blur of movement, but then it coalesced into something more solid, more distinct. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing just at the edge of my vision. I could see its form now, and yet I couldn't fully comprehend it. It was like a mirage, shifting and flickering, never truly staying still. The figure was human, but not. Its limbs were too long, too thin, stretching at unnatural angles. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a blur of dark shadows and hollow eyes. The more I tried to focus on it, the more it seemed to slip away, like a bad dream that you can't quite grasp no matter how hard you try. But I knew it was there. I felt it in my bones, and it was looking at me. There was no sound, no words, no movement from the figure. It simply stood there, watching. I couldn't tear my eyes away, but I could feel something stirring inside me, an instinct to run, to flee from the thing that stood before me. But my feet were rooted to the ground. I couldn't move. Then, the whispering started again, only this time the voices were louder, closer. They weren't just whispers now. They were words. They were calling to me. "Come closer." The voices breathed in unison. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even an invitation. It was a command. My body moved before I even realized it. My legs, no longer my own, carried me toward the figure. I tried to resist, tried to fight against the pull of it, but my body betrayed me. I couldn't stop. I was being drawn in, step by step, closer to the thing that waited for me in the mist. As I approached, the air around me grew colder, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic. The figure's face came into view, if it could even be called a face. It was a mass of shifting shadows, an ever-changing void that seemed to suck in the light around it. And in that void, I thought I saw something, a glimpse of something deeper, something darker. Eyes, hundreds of eyes, all staring at me, watching me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. This thing, whatever it was not human. It was not even alive in the way I understood life. It was a thing of darkness, a thing that existed beyond comprehension. It was a creature of the abyss, born from the void, and it had been waiting for me. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to twist around me, pressing down on me like a physical force. I couldn't breathe. My lungs were screaming for air. But it was as though the very atmosphere had become thick and oppressive, too heavy to inhale. The darkness seemed to close in, squeezing tighter and tighter around me. Then, just as I thought I would suffocate, I heard something else. Something that didn't belong. A voice. Not the whispering, not the beckoning call, but a voice, clear and distinct. "Run!" It was a command, not a suggestion, a sharp, desperate word that cut through the haze of the whispers. And before I could process what it meant, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It didn't shuffle. It was like the air itself bent around it, warping as it stretched toward me. Its limbs seemed to elongate, distorting into grotesque shapes, reaching out with fingers too long, too twisted, too many. The mist around it swirled, the ground beneath my feet shifting again, as if the entire world was folding in on itself. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. My legs moved of their own accord, but my mind was still caught in the nightmare. I could hear the creature behind me, its footsteps silent, but somehow the sound of its presence was deafening, like the crashing of waves against an endless shore. I didn't dare look back, but the feeling of its presence pressed against me, suffocating, consuming. I ran through the mist, through the twisting, warping expanse, not knowing where I was going or how to escape. I was trapped in a maze with no way out, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. I had to escape. But the more I ran, the further I seemed to get from anything familiar. The world around me stretched and shifted, the ground beneath my feet turning soft, like the flesh of some ancient rotting beast. I couldn't make sense of it. I didn't know if I was moving forward or backward. It was as though the very fabric of reality had unraveled. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I stumbled upon something. A door. It stood in the mist, solid and real, as though it had always been there. It was an ordinary wooden door with peeling paint and rusted hinges, but it felt out of place, like an anchor in a world that had no right to be anchored. Without thinking, I reached for the handle, turned it, and stepped through. The world collapsed. The shadows screamed, and I fell into the void. Chapter 5. The Echoes of the Forgotten. The door slammed shut behind me, sealing the world I had known before into oblivion. For a moment, there was nothing but the silence, a deep, oppressive silence that filled the air like thick, suffocating fog. I stood still, the echo of the door's closing reverberating through my chest, feeling the tremors of it seep into my bones. I was no longer in the mist, no longer in the twisted maze that seemed to defy all logic. The space I found myself in was something entirely different, something more alien, more unsettling. It was a room, or at least, I thought it was a room. The walls were made of wood, rotting and decaying, as if the very foundation of this place had been abandoned centuries ago. The air was musty, laden with the scent of mildew, and something worse, something that clung to the edges of my consciousness like a shadow, something I couldn't identify but instinctively knew was wrong. The floor beneath my feet was covered in dust, the kind that tells you no one has walked here in years, maybe even decades. There was an odd, half-rotten chair in the corner, its fabric torn, its structure bent at an unnatural angle, like it had been thrown there in haste. The room, though small, felt like an endless expanse. The walls seemed to shift with every blink, bending in subtle ways that made my stomach churn. The air itself was thick, heavy, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned in a circle, scanning the room, looking for any sign of life, or death, for that matter. Nothing. Just the darkness. A pale light filtered through a cracked window, casting eerie shadows across the floor. The light was odd, not like the sun's natural rays, but something colder, more distant. It made the shadows sharper, more defined, as if the darkness in this place had substance, a life of its own. I tried to think, tried to focus, but my mind felt like it was unraveling. How had I gotten here? Where was I? And why, despite the obvious decay and ruin, did this place feel so familiar? The answers eluded me, slipping just out of reach. But I could feel them, clawing at the back of my mind like something buried deep inside, begging to be uncovered. My eyes moved to the farthest corner of the room, where a faded old mirror hung crookedly. It was framed in tarnished gold, its edges jagged and worn. For a moment, I thought I saw something move within its reflection, just a flash of something dark. But when I blinked, the reflection was still, the glass empty. I took a step toward it, the creak of my boots against the wooden floor sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I drew closer to the mirror. I reached out a hand, and for a moment, I hesitated. The surface of the mirror seemed to ripple slightly, as though it was alive, breathing. But it was too late to stop now. The impulse to touch it, to feel it, was too strong. My fingers brushed against the glass, and it was ice cold, colder than it should have been. And then it happened. The reflection in the mirror distorted. It wasn't me who stared back at me anymore. It was someone else, a face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare through me. The figure was clothed in rags, their skin stretched tight over bones, their expression twisted in an eternal scream of agony. My heart slammed in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. I recoiled, my hand jerking back, but the figure in the mirror did not move. Instead, it smiled. A grotesque, inhuman grin spread across its face, widening impossibly. The eyes that had once stared at me with terror now gleamed with something darker, something malevolent. A laugh, hollow and mocking, reverberated through the room, echoing off the walls and shattering the silence like a broken bell. It spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was a rasp, a whisper that seemed to emanate from deep within the pit of my stomach. It vibrated through me, as though the words were not just spoken, but felt, as though they resonated within my very soul. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling beneath me, but the figure's gaze never left me. Its smile remained frozen, its eyes unblinking, as if it was savoring my fear, feeding off it. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at that grin, that horrible, unnatural smile that promised something far worse than anything I had ever experienced. I forced myself to turn away, breaking the connection. The mirror remained still, the room returning to its silence. But I could still feel the presence of the thing in the glass. It was watching me, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for me to make my next move. The air felt colder now, heavier. The shadows seemed to crawl along the floor, like tendrils of darkness reaching toward me. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. I turned toward the door I had come through, but it wasn't there anymore. I froze. The doorway was gone. The walls that had once seemed solid and real now stretched impossibly far, as if the room was breathing, expanding and contracting with each passing second. My pulse quickened, and my breath came in shallow gasps. The room was alive. It was changing. I staggered back, my eyes darting around in panic, searching for another way out. But there was nothing. The walls pressed in on me, closing the space. I was trapped. Suddenly, the floor beneath me gave way. I plunged into darkness, falling, tumbling, spiraling downward, the cold air rushing past me like 1,000 icy fingers. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the void. The world twisted, turning, disorienting me as I fell deeper and deeper into the unknown. And then, just when I thought I would be consumed by the darkness, I landed, hard. The impact stole the breath from my lungs, and I lay still, gasping for air, disoriented. The ground beneath me felt wrong, soft, shifting. I slowly pushed myself to my hands and knees, my heart still racing, my mind reeling. I looked around, but the darkness was absolute. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, couldn't hear anything beyond the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. But there was something in the air, something else. I felt it before I heard it. Soft, barely perceptible. A whisper. It slithered through the darkness like a serpent, curling around my thoughts, suffocating my mind. The whisper grew louder, clearer, until it became unmistakable. "Welcome home." The voice was soft, but there was nothing gentle about it. It was cold. It was ancient. It was a voice from the depths of the earth, from a place where the light never reached. And then, I felt it. A hand, cold as death, clasped around my wrist. A sharp, bone-crushing grip that sent a jolt of pain through my body. I tried to scream, but my throat was frozen, my breath trapped in my chest. I was not alone. Chapter 6. The Depths of Silence. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the low, resonant hum of something unseen. It clawed at my senses, pulling me deeper into the unrelenting blackness that surrounded me. I could hear my own breath, ragged and strained, as though each inhalation brought me closer to suffocation. I was no longer aware of time. I had lost track of it completely. The stillness was unbearable. Yet there was movement within it, something moving just beyond the reach of my senses. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me. The ground was uneven, soft in places, like dirt, and hard in others, like stone. My fingers, trembling from the cold, scraped across the surface beneath me, searching for something solid, something to ground me in this place of endless dark. But there was nothing. The darkness, the endless black that enveloped me, felt infinite. I had no idea where I was, no clue how far I had fallen, or where I had landed. The whisper still echoed faintly in my ears, a distant reminder that I was not alone. "Welcome home." The words repeated in my mind, like a mantra, a curse that clung to me, suffocating me. I stumbled forward, blindly reaching out for anything that might give me a sense of direction, a sense of reality. My fingertips brushed against something slick and smooth, almost wet. I recoiled instinctively, pulling my hand back as though burned. The sensation lingered in my skin, and I felt a cold sweat break out along my spine. Then a noise, a soft, scuttling sound, barely perceptible at first, but growing louder. closer. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't just the whisper now. There was something else, something more tangible. My breath caught in my throat as the sound grew into something more distinct, more deliberate. It was the sound of something moving, slithering along the ground, something that was getting nearer. I looked around frantically, my eyes wide and unseeing in the dark, my pulse quickening. There was no escape, no way to flee from the impending presence that I could feel closing in on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. A dead silence, an unnatural quiet. But even in that silence, I could feel it. Something, just beyond the threshold of my perception. It was watching me. I slowly turned in a circle, my breath shallow and erratic, trying to listen for any clue, any hint of where I was or what was lurking in the dark. But the silence had returned, heavier now, pressing in on me from all sides. Then I heard it again, a faint, barely perceptible scratching, like nails dragging across stone. But it wasn't just one sound, it was multiple, a chorus of whispers, of voices, of claws scraping against the ground, coming from every direction. I closed my eyes tightly, my mind a maelstrom of fear and confusion. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. My feet were rooted to the spot, my muscles frozen in place. All I could do was stand there, my heart racing, listening to the rising cacophony of scraping, whispering, skittering, growing louder and louder until it seemed to fill the very air around me. And then it stopped, a sudden eerie stillness. My breathing slowed, the panic subsiding slightly, but I could still feel it. They were there, watching, waiting. The sensation of being surrounded by something unseen, something malevolent, filled me entirely. That was when I heard the voice. It was a soft whisper, a breath against my ear, so faint that it was barely a sound at all. But it wasn't in the air around me. It came from inside my head, inside my mind. The voice was familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. You shouldn't have come. The voice was barely a whisper, yet it shook my very soul, sending an icy chill through my body. It was a voice I had heard before, but from where? The words echoed in my mind like a bell tolling in the distance, distant but urgent, pulling me back into the depths of the unknown. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, the taste of fear sharp in my mouth. My body wanted to scream, to cry out, but the words would not come. Something had a hold on me, something invisible, something primal that kept me silent, paralyzed in place. The darkness seemed to close in on me even more, the walls pressing inward, tighter and tighter, until I could barely breathe. I gasped for air, but it felt like the very oxygen was being stolen from my lungs. Then, a shadow moved. It was a blur at first, just a flicker in the corner of my vision, but it grew, taking shape, becoming something tangible. My heart leapt in my chest as the figure emerged from the abyss, its form undulating, shifting in the darkness like a living thing. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its body swaying like a tree in the wind. Its features were hidden in the shadows, but I could see its eyes. Eyes that burned with an unnatural glow, bright and gleaming, staring at me with a hunger that chilled me to my core. I stumbled backward, my hands flying out in front of me, searching for something, anything, to stop my fall. But there was nothing. My fingers brushed against cold, wet walls, and I recoiled in disgust. The darkness seemed to close in around me, pushing me toward the figure. The creature, if that's what it was, moved closer, its movements slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, and its mouth opened, revealing a row of jagged, needle-like teeth. I knew then, without a doubt, that I was in the presence of something ancient, something beyond human comprehension, something that had been waiting for me, waiting for someone. The whispering began again. "It's too late for you." I felt the words, felt them vibrate through me, rip through the very fabric of my being. The creature's eyes glinted in the darkness, its smile widening, as though savoring my fear, feeding off it. I stumbled back, but the walls closed in even further, the space shrinking, pressing against me. The air grew colder, suffocatingly cold, and I could feel the weight of the creature's presence in every fiber of my body. My heart hammered in my chest, my thoughts spinning in a frenzy, and I knew I had nowhere to run. The creature stepped closer, and in that moment, I realized something. This was not just a physical presence. This was a presence that had been waiting, that had been feeding on the terror of those who came before me. It wasn't just after my body. It wanted my soul. It wanted to consume everything that I was, to drag me into the abyss where time did not exist and the dark never faded. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by its presence, trapped in a nightmare that was all too real. And then, it spoke again. "You're mine now." The voice was a low growl, a rasping sound that filled my mind, drowning out everything else. The creature's eyes flashed brightly, and the world around me seemed to dissolve, like I was falling again, deeper into the darkness. But this time, I didn't scream. Chapter 7. The Wretched Echo. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It had become something else, a living, breathing thing, slithering around me, pressing against my skin like 1,000 invisible fingers. Every breath I took was a battle, the air thick with a weight that seemed to suffocate my very soul. I was no longer sure of where I stood, or even if I stood at all. The ground beneath me felt unreal, its texture shifting with each step I took. It was as though the very earth itself was alive, responding to my presence, to my fear. I was alone, or so I thought. I had been lost in this darkness for what felt like an eternity. Time no longer had meaning here. The moments bled into one another, stretching, distorting, until it was impossible to distinguish one from the other. Every sound, every whisper, every movement was an echo of something I could not understand. My senses were dulled, but still there was something out there, something waiting. The creature was still close. I could feel it. Its presence was like a shadow creeping over my very skin, making my blood run cold. It had spoken to me, told me that I was its now, but there was more to it than that. Something deeper, something more insidious. I was being drawn into it, into the heart of this darkness, and I knew that the more I resisted, the tighter its grip would become. But the fear, it was all-consuming. It paralyzed me, making it impossible to think, impossible to act. I had no escape. I had no choice but to stumble forward, following the faint sounds of something in the distance. Perhaps there was a way out. Perhaps there was salvation. But the thought was fleeting as the brief glimmers of light that sometimes seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision, only to vanish when I reached for them. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. At first, they had been unintelligible, like the murmur of a crowd, distant and hazy. But now they were clearer, more defined, like voices, human voices, echoing through the void. "Come closer," one whispered. A voice so soft, so sweet, that it almost felt like a caress. "It's almost time." I froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, familiar, but twisted somehow, like the echo of someone I had once known. But I couldn't remember who. I reached out, my hand trembling, trying to grasp the sound, to hold on to something, anything that could make sense of this nightmare. The darkness seemed to pulse around me, as though it were alive, feeding off my desperation. "Don't fight it." The voice came again, closer this time, and I felt it inside me, curling around my thoughts, my very consciousness. It was calling me, drawing me toward it. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my body betrayed me. I couldn't move. The terror was so complete, so overwhelming that it had rendered me immobile, my limbs heavy, like I was being pulled deeper into the very fabric of this place. Then, I felt it. The touch, cold, wet, and clammy. It was as if something had wrapped its hand around mine, pulling me further into the abyss. I recoiled, but the grip tightened, unyielding. The air around me grew colder, the temperature dropping with each passing second, until it felt like I was standing in the heart of winter. I tried to pull away, but it was useless. The darkness was closing in around me, the weight of it pressing on my chest, suffocating me. The whispers were everywhere now, a cacophony of voices, all indistinguishable from one another, all blending into a single unified sound. "Join us!" The words felt like a command, a decree. I felt the pull intensify, the force dragging me toward whatever lay ahead. My feet moved without my consent, the ground beneath me no longer solid but shifting, like a river of sand slipping through my toes. And then, through the blackness, I saw it, a faint glow, distant at first, but growing brighter with each passing second. It was a soft, pale light, almost ethereal, and it beckoned me like a lighthouse in the storm. I could feel its warmth, though it was faint, like the embers of a dying fire. Without thinking, I took a step toward it, then another, and another. The whispering subsided, replaced by the soft rhythmic sound of my own footsteps, echoing against the emptiness. The light grew brighter still, and I felt my heart race in anticipation. Could this be the way out? Could this be the salvation I had been seeking? But as I neared the light, something in the air shifted. The warmth of the light was replaced by a sudden chill, one that cut through my skin and into my very bones. My pulse quickened, and I found myself hesitating, uncertain whether I should continue. Then I saw it. In the center of the glowing light stood a figure, tall, skeletal, draped in rags. It was not human. Its form was thin, emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its bones, as though it had been starved for centuries. Its face was obscured, covered by a dark hood that seemed to absorb the light around it. But the eyes, its eyes, burned with a cold, unholy fire. I froze, my blood running cold. The creature did not move. It simply stood there, watching me, its gaze penetrating, as though it could see straight through me. "You've come far." The voice was low, raspy, like the scraping of bones against stone. "But you are too late." The words felt like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, as though trying to break free from its cage. I wanted to run, to turn and flee back into the darkness, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The figure reached out, its long, bony hand extending toward me, and I could see the fingers, each one elongated, sharp like claws, stretching toward me, almost as if in invitation. "There is no escape," it whispered, its voice seeping into my mind. "You belong to this place now. There is no leaving." I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The darkness pressed in around me, the cold seeping deeper into my skin, and I felt a terrible heaviness in my chest. And then, in the blink of an eye, the creature was gone. The light vanished as well, leaving me standing in the suffocating darkness, alone again. The silence returned, pressing against my ears, ringing in my skull. But I was no longer alone. I could hear them, whispering from the depths of the void, their voices like the rustling of dead leaves, low and indistinct. They had been waiting for me, for someone like me, for a soul. I collapsed to my knees, my body shaking uncontrollably, the weight of everything pressing down on me, suffocating me, until there was nothing left but the darkness and the whispers, and the knowledge. I was trapped. Chapter 7, Part 2, The Grip Tightens. I couldn't move. The heavy, suffocating air around me held me in place like a vice, every attempt to breathe feeling like a battle I was losing. The whispers that had been my only companion in this nightmare, seemed to grow louder now, almost as if they were inside me, wrapping around my mind, curling into the deepest recesses of my thoughts. They spoke in tongues, an incomprehensible murmuring that wove through the darkness, but I could feel it. I could feel the weight of the words, like the hands of unseen figures pressing against my skull, trying to force my thoughts to bend to their will. "You can't escape." The voice was no longer distant. It was inside me, close. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, trying to shut off the world that pressed in from all sides. But the pressure only intensified. Every breath I took was heavier than the last. I opened my eyes again, searching for anything, any sign of escape. But all I saw was the crushing void, the same unbroken blackness that had been swallowing me whole since I first stepped into this nightmare. The whispers morphed, forming words that began to make sense. "Come back to us. You were always meant to join us." I wanted to scream, but my voice refused to cooperate. It felt like the air had been stolen from my lungs, suffocating me from the inside out. My limbs grew weak, like they no longer belonged to me. I was becoming part of this place, this thing, this endless, oppressive nightmare that had no beginning and no end. I staggered to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me. The ground shifted underfoot, its texture now more pliable, like wet clay, bending and warping with every movement I made. It was as if the earth itself was alive, reacting to me, to my presence. But the sensation was wrong. Too wrong. There was no solid foundation beneath me, only a feeling that I was floating, drifting deeper into an abyss where time didn't exist and reality had no meaning. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence. A crack, sharp and unnatural, like the breaking of bones. I spun around, my heart thumping painfully in my chest, my eyes scanning the darkness for any hint of movement. And then I saw it. A figure, emaciated, gaunt, its body unnaturally twisted, emerged from the blackness like a phantom. The shadows clung to it, swirling and writhing around its form. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs stretched out in grotesque, unnatural angles. It was as if its body had been bent by some cruel force, forcing it to conform to an impossible shape. But the worst part wasn't its form. It was its eyes. They were wide, unblinking, glowing faintly in the darkness, like two pits of fire, burning with an unnatural hunger. I could feel its gaze on me, piercing through the veil of darkness, cutting into my very soul. The creature didn't move at first. It simply stood there, its head cocked to one side, as though it were studying me, measuring my fear. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it began to step forward. Each step was slow, heavy, as if it were testing the ground beneath it, making sure that it wouldn't collapse under its weight. The creature's feet were bare, the skin black and cracked, like charred leather. With every step it took, I could feel the ground beneath me tremble, the air around me vibrate with an energy I couldn't comprehend. "You don't belong here." The voice that came from its mouth was low, guttural, and filled with something ancient. It wasn't a sound that belonged to any living being. It was the voice of something far older, far more malevolent. I wanted to turn and run, to flee from this thing, but my legs refused to obey me. It was as if the darkness had already claimed me, already owned me, and I was no longer free to make my own choices. The creature stopped just in front of me, its face mere inches from mine. The air was thick with its stench, rotting, decaying, like the smell of something long dead. Its breath was cold and ragged, brushing against my skin like the caress of a corpse. It reached out, its long, twisted fingers trembling as they hovered above my face. The sight of those fingers, so thin, so brittle, like the bones of a long-forgotten corpse, made my stomach turn. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was as though my body had been frozen in place, caught in the grip of something far more powerful than my will. And then the whispers returned, louder, more frantic now, as if they were in a frenzy. "It is time." The words seemed to echo around me, reverberating off the walls of the darkness, filling my mind with their sickening repetition. I felt my heart race in my chest, my pulse pounding in my ears. The creature's hand finally descended, its fingers brushing against my cheek. The touch was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt before, colder than ice, colder than death itself. It was like the touch of the grave, the touch of the long-forgotten dead. And then, I felt it. The sensation was indescribable, like something being pulled from deep within me, as if the creature was stealing my very essence, my soul. It wasn't physical, not entirely, but I could feel it. An emptiness, a hollowing out, like a part of me was being torn away, piece by piece. I gasped, my breath ragged and shallow, and tried to pull away, but I couldn't. My body refused to move. I could feel the weight of its presence bearing down on me. pressing into me, suffocating me. The shadows swirled around us, thick and dense, and I could hear the whispers again, louder now, almost deafening. "You're ours now." The words chilled me to my core, and the realization hit me like a cold wave crashing over my mind. This was no mere encounter. This was no random nightmare. This thing, this creature, this force had been waiting for me. It had drawn me here, into this abyss, and it would not let me go. I was its now, its prisoner in this endless void, trapped in a place where light never touched, where time had no meaning, and where hope had long since been devoured by the shadows. And as the creature's hand curled around my throat, as I felt my consciousness slipping away, I knew one thing for certain: there was no escape. There never had been. Chapter 8. The darkness follows. The world had become a blur of sensations, grinding, suffocating, each breath more laborious than the last. I felt the weight of the creature's hand still pressed against my throat, a coldness that seemed to seep deep into my bones, spreading like ice through my veins. The air itself felt like it had turned to lead, pressing down on me from all sides, suffocating any thought, any hope of escape. My body trembled, but not from the cold. It was the fear, the primal, gnawing fear that had taken root in me the moment I stepped into this cursed place. My chest tightened, each breath becoming more shallow, as if I were drowning in the very air around me. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but my voice betrayed me, leaving me voiceless. The shadows, they surrounded me, pressing in like an unyielding force, like they were alive, eager to consume me whole. I could hear the creature's voice, that guttural whisper, rising from the pit of its chest. The words were familiar now. The whispers had come before, but they had a new meaning, a new weight. "You belong to us now," it hissed, its breath a cold wind that froze my skin, leaving it raw and burning. It wasn't just the words, it was the feeling, the sense of inevitability, the knowledge that I was no longer in control, that the world around me had changed, had become something else entirely, something twisted and malevolent, and I was its captive, its prey. The shadows weren't just following me anymore, they were inside me. In my mind, I could see it now, clearer than before. The creature's form, the towering figure, skeletal, warped, bending unnaturally in ways no human body could. Its eyes, those glowing pits of fire, burned with an ancient malice. But it wasn't just the creature I saw. I saw the space around me, the endless black void, the unrelenting abyss that stretched for miles, but I couldn't look away. It was like I was stuck inside a loop, each second stretching into infinity, each heartbeat echoing through the cavernous silence. Suddenly, I felt its grip on my throat loosen. Not enough to free me. No, not that, but enough to allow me to inhale, to draw a ragged breath into my lungs. It was all I could do to survive in this suffocating dark. I gasped, my breath harsh and wheezing, the air feeling sharp in my throat. The creature loomed above me, still towering, still waiting. Its form seemed to shift with the flicker of every thought, twisting and reshaping like liquid. But there was something else now, a subtle sound, a shift, a rustle in the stillness. Was it waiting? Waiting for something? I couldn't tell. The air was thick with anticipation, with a sense of something drawing closer, but I couldn't grasp it, couldn't understand it fully. And then, from somewhere deep in the darkness, I heard it, a low hum, vibrating in the depths of the void, reverberating through my bones. The hum grew louder, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to follow it. It wasn't a choice, not anymore. There was a force at work here, something beyond my comprehension. I had become a puppet, and it was pulling my strings. My body moved of its own accord, jerking forward, my feet stumbling as I walked deeper into the abyss. The creature didn't stop me. It merely watched, its unblinking eyes tracking my every movement. The ground beneath me shifted, warping as I stepped. At times it felt like the earth itself was breathing, like it was alive, trying to draw me into its depths. The hum grew louder, clearer, Now unmistakably a voice, a whispering voice, but not the creature's. This one was different, softer. It seemed familiar, yet foreign, as though it was calling to me from the deepest recesses of my own mind. "Come closer," it whispered, the voice swirling around me like smoke, curling into my ears, filling my thoughts. It was calling me. But why? Why did it want me to come closer? The darkness seemed to thin, just slightly, as I approached the source of the hum. I could see faint outlines, blurred shapes moving in the distance, like shadows given form. My legs moved without my consent, dragging me closer, pulling me into the unknown, and then it was there. A faint glow, barely visible at first, but growing brighter with each step I took. It pulsed, rhythmically, like the beat of a heart. Slow, deliberate, thumping. It wasn't light, not truly, but a sickly pale glow that seemed to radiate from the walls of the void itself. There, standing before me, was a figure. I could barely make it out at first, the outline shrouded in the sickly glow, but as I drew closer, the figure became clearer. It was tall, humanoid in shape, but distorted. Its limbs were too long, too thin, like twigs stripped bare of flesh. It had no face, not a single feature to identify it as human. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just smooth, featureless skin stretched tightly over the bones, like a mannequin abandoned in the dark. And in its chest, in the center of its body, was the source of the glow, a pulsating light, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing second, until it became almost blinding. I reached out instinctively, drawn to it, but as my fingers brushed against its skin, a sudden shock of cold shot through me, freezing me in place. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The figure's shape began to distort, twisting and shifting in ways that made my stomach churn. It seemed to ripple like water, every movement sharp and jerky. The light in its chest flickered, casting shadows that danced along the walls of the void. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a presence, an impression, a sensation that filled my mind like a thought that wasn't my own. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was not a sound, but a feeling, a cold, biting realization that swept through me, seizing my thoughts, suffocating them. I had no words left, no thoughts to give. It wasn't just speaking, it was touching my mind, crawling through the deepest, darkest corners of my consciousness, and I could do nothing to stop it. The figure's hand reached out, slowly, deliberately, and rested upon my forehead. The moment it touched me, a searing pain shot through my skull, radiating outward, exploding in every direction. I felt my body seize up, felt the darkness encircle me tighter, like a trap that had been set long ago. In that moment, I knew there was no escape. Not now, not ever. "You belong to us," it whispered, and I felt my mind unravel, the last thread of sanity slipping through my fingers, and then nothing. Chapter 9. The Fractured Mind. I woke with a start. My body was stiff, as if I had been lying in one position for days. I couldn't remember when I had fallen asleep, or if I had slept at all. The shadows pressed in around me, darker now than before, like the very air had thickened into something more viscous, something alive. My chest tightened with the weight of it, the heaviness of the unknown pressing down, suffocating me. I gasped for air, but it felt like I was breathing through something other than my lungs, like the air was foreign, wrong. I could still feel the lingering presence of the creature, its icy fingers brushing my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, threading its way through the edges of my consciousness. The whispers, too, had returned, soft at first, like a distant murmur in the back of my mind, but growing louder with every second, rising in pitch, gaining clarity. "Come closer," it whispered again, that same insidious voice that had haunted me from the moment I set foot in this cursed place. Closer still. I shuddered, my skin crawling at the sound of it, the words almost familiar, like an echo from a dream. Or was it a nightmare? Was I still dreaming, or had I crossed some threshold into another reality entirely, one where nothing made sense, and time itself was nothing more than a cruel joke? I forced myself to sit up, my limbs moving sluggishly, as if they didn't belong to me. My fingers were numb, my joints stiff and unwilling to obey. The darkness around me seemed endless, stretching out in all directions, the oppressive weight of it closing in, crushing me. The faint glow I had seen in the distance, the one that had once beckoned me forward, was gone, replaced by an all-encompassing blackness. It felt like I was floating, untethered, lost in a void with no beginning and no end. A sudden sharp sound broke the silence, a crack like a branch snapping in the dead of night. My heart jumped in my chest, and my eyes darted around, seeking any movement in the gloom. But there was nothing, just the endless void, just the suffocating stillness. I stood up, my legs unsteady, my head swimming. The ground beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy, like I was walking on thick moss or damp earth. But when I looked down, I saw nothing, just more blackness, the ground invisible, as if it had dissolved into the darkness. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, my mind racing. There was something out there. I could feel it, just beyond the edges of my awareness. Something moving, something watching me. Suddenly, I heard it. A low, guttural noise, like a growl, but distorted, as if it was being choked, muffled. It came from all around me, from the walls of the darkness itself. The air grew colder, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if eyes, many, many eyes, were boring into me from every direction, studying my every move, waiting for me to falter. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, trying to calm the panic that threatened to rise up within me. But it was impossible. The more I tried to ignore the noise, the more it seemed to grow, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I am always watching. The voice came again, this time, not from a whisper, but from everywhere, from the very air itself. It echoed in my ears, vibrating deep within my skull, as if the words were etched into my very bones. My legs felt weak, like I might collapse at any moment, but I couldn't stop. I had to move. I had to escape whatever this was, whatever was lurking in the darkness. My feet carried me forward, but it felt like I was running in place, as if the ground beneath me was shifting, pulling me in circles. The growl grew louder, louder still, until it felt like it was inside my head, rattling my thoughts, clouding my mind with fear. Suddenly, a flicker of light, faint, barely perceptible, appeared ahead. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. Could it be? Was it the glow I had seen before, the one that had pulled me forward? I stumbled toward it, desperate for some sign of life, some escape from the suffocating darkness. As I drew closer, the light flickered again, more brightly this time, like a distant star caught in the vastness of the void. It wasn't just a glow, though. I could see shapes within the light, dark, twisted shapes that writhed and twisted like living shadows. Figures, moving and undulating, but inhuman. They were not right. I hesitated, fear pooling in my gut. What were they? Were they the source of the hum I had heard earlier? Were they the ones calling to me? As if sensing my hesitation, the figures seemed to turn toward me, their movements jerky, unnatural. Their eyes, if they even had eyes, glowed with an unnatural, sickly light, and their mouths opened wide in a grotesque imitation of a scream. But no sound came. Instead, the air around me hummed, a low, vibrating noise that set my teeth on edge, that rattled my bones. I wanted to turn and run, but my body wouldn't obey. It felt like something was keeping me rooted to the spot, holding me in place, forcing me to watch as the figures slowly advanced toward me. They moved in jerks, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings, their limbs unnaturally long, their movements stiff and awkward. And then, without warning, one of them lunged forward, its arms stretching impossibly long, its fingers reaching out for me. I screamed with everything I had, but no sound came. Only the hum, only the whisper, only the feeling of something cold and malevolent reaching for me, its touch colder than death itself. As the creature's fingers brushed against my skin, a shock of cold raced through my body, sending my mind reeling. I felt my consciousness fracture, splintering into pieces, slipping away from me. I was falling deeper into the darkness, deeper into the grasp of the void, and I couldn't stop it. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the creature's face. A twisted, grotesque mask of shadows, with eyes that burned like twin pits of fire. Chapter 10. The Hollow Place. I woke with no memory of how I had arrived in this place. My body was cold, the chill seeping deep into my bones, as though I had been abandoned in the heart of winter. My limbs felt heavy and foreign, not my own, as if they had been twisted and bent out of shape during a long, terrible sleep. I couldn't move at first, couldn't even bring myself to open my eyes. The weight of the air around me pressed down like a stone, suffocating, unmoving. It was a silence so absolute that I could feel it in the marrow of my bones. Then, slowly, I dared to open my eyes. The world around me was not the same. It was as though reality itself had splintered, fractured, bent into impossible angles that didn't quite fit together. The ground was soft beneath me, shifting, as though I were lying on a bed of damp earth. But the edges of my vision blurred, as if the world was viewed through water. Everything was hazy, unreal. I tried to sit up, but my body refused to comply. The muscles in my legs locked in place. My hands trembled, my fingers numb, and I found myself staring at them in confusion. They were pale, almost translucent in the dim light. No blood rushed to the surface, no warmth, just cold. Nothing felt real. Where am I? The words left my lips in a hoarse whisper, and I immediately regretted them. There was no answer. Only silence, the kind that chokes and strangles, pressing in on all sides, as if the air itself was alive and holding its breath. I pushed myself to my feet, my knees giving way at first, but I fought against it. The ground beneath me rippled and shifted, the darkness around me seemingly warping in time with my every movement. There was a strange feeling that I wasn't truly standing on the earth, as if I was floating inches above the surface, a mere spectre in this strange, fractured place. I looked around, but what I saw made no sense. There were no landmarks, no familiar surroundings to anchor me to reality, just endless stretches of shadow and a dim, sickly glow that seemed to pulse from somewhere far away, as though it were calling to me. The glow flickered like a candle, feeble but persistent, drawing me in. I could feel it pulling at me, like a magnetic force that I couldn't resist, no matter how hard I tried. With each step I took toward the glow, the world seemed to bend even further. The shadows stretched longer, the air thicker, suffocating. The ground beneath me, if it could even be called ground, felt less like earth and more like an extension of the darkness itself, a place where nothing had weight, nothing had form. The sound of my footsteps echoed hollowly, an unnerving reminder that I was alone in this vast, empty expanse. I could still hear the whispers, the same whispers I had heard before, faint and distorted, but always there, seeping into my mind, burrowing beneath my thoughts like insects gnawing at my insides. You shouldn't have come. The voice was deeper now, a growl more than a whisper, sending a shiver down my spine. It was familiar, though I could not place it. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body felt numb. I couldn't move faster. I could only walk, drawn ever closer to the glowing light, though I knew better than to follow it. I had learned the hard way that following such lights always led to darkness, to horrors beyond comprehension. But still I moved, slowly, reluctantly. The whispers became louder with every step, until they were no longer whispers but voices. Many voices, overlapping and rising in a cacophony of rage, pleading, and despair. You shouldn't have come. I froze. The voice sounded so close now, so tangible, that I felt the breath of it against the back of my neck. It was not just in my ears, not just in my mind. It was in the air, surrounding me, choking me. I spun around. There was nothing. Only the oppressive blackness, stretching on endlessly. But then, I heard it. A sound, faint at first, but growing stronger with every passing second. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps, as though someone, was approaching me. I turned again, expecting to see nothing. But this time, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing in the distance, almost too far to see clearly. The dim light flickered, casting strange shadows, but I could make out the shape of the figure. Too human to be anything else, but somehow not human at all. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, as if it were being pulled along by invisible strings. The figure seemed to sway, its limbs twitching with an odd rhythm, like a marionette being manipulated by unseen hands. "Come closer," the voice whispered again. This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was an invitation. The figure took another step forward, its face hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. Even if I couldn't see them, I could feel its gaze burrowing into my very soul. My pulse quickened. The panic rose again, clawing at my chest, urging me to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, watching, helpless. The figure spoke again, its voice an echo of the first whisper, but this time it wasn't a command, it was an offering. "It's all for you, all of it. Come closer, and you will see." I wanted to scream, to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot, something more powerful than fear itself. Was it the dark force behind the figure, or was it the promise it had made, the promise of seeing? A sudden shift in the air made me flinch. The world around me felt wrong, more wrong than before. The edges of my vision blurred even further, the dim light fading, and the space around me warped, twisting and folding upon itself. The shadows deepened, pressing in, becoming thicker, more oppressive. It was as if the entire reality around me was collapsing in on itself, folding into the figure that stood before me. "Come to me." The voice was no longer a whisper, it was a command. I moved. My body acted before I had a chance to protest. My legs moving forward, my feet dragging me toward the figure, toward the something that waited. I wanted to stop, to scream, but my mouth was dry, my body numb, as if I were not even inside myself anymore. I was being led, pulled, dragged by an invisible force, compelled by a will far stronger than my own. The closer I got, the more I could see, the more I could understand. The figure was no longer a shadow. It was a man, but not a man. The skin was stretched too tight across the bones, the flesh a sickly grey, as if it had been dead for years. Its eyes were black holes, empty and vast, as if they had swallowed all light. It smiled at me, but not with kindness. No, it was a grotesque parody of a smile, one that was stretched too wide, too long, as though it was a mask barely held together. I was standing before it now, close enough to reach out and touch it, and I did. My fingers brushed against its cold, lifeless skin, and it felt like I was touching the surface of ice, a layer of frozen nothingness. It leaned in, close enough for me to feel the warmth of its breath against my ear, its voice a rasping whisper. "Welcome to the end of all things." Part 2. I didn't move. I couldn't. My feet were planted, like the roots of a tree deeply embedded in the ground, but there was no ground, no earth. Just endless blackness. The figure leaned closer, its breath icy, the stale air creeping into my lungs, filling them with a chill that went deeper than physical cold. It was a gnawing, biting emptiness, an existential void that threatened to swallow me whole. I wanted to scream, but no sound emerged. My mouth was dry, as if the very essence of life was being drained from me, leaving only the sensation of dread in its wake. The figure's face, if you could even call it a face, was a distortion of human features, a grotesque mockery of life. The skin pulled tight over its skull, stretched to the point of tearing. Its eyes, those endless pits of darkness, never blinked. They simply stared, gazing into me, as though they were searching for something inside my soul. I was no longer in control of my body. My hands trembled violently at my sides, and yet I couldn't will them to move. A heavy, suffocating force gripped my chest. The light around us flickered again, casting long, skeletal shadows that swayed and twisted like the limbs of something not quite human. The air hummed, thick with tension. Then, without warning, the voice came again. Low, gravelly. A whisper so close to my ear that I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. Do you understand now? Do you see the truth? Truth. The word hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. The truth. What truth? I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't form. All I could do was stare, paralyzed, at the thing in front of me. The figure reached out with a bony hand, its fingers elongated, unnaturally long, tipped with black nails that scraped against the air like a whisper itself. Its touch was icy, colder than anything I had ever felt. It grazed my cheek, the touch so light it might have been a phantom. But the sensation reverberated through my entire body, sending a shockwave of panic straight to my heart. This place is where they are, it rasped. This is where they've all gone. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to recoil, but I couldn't. I was trapped in its gaze, bound by something more powerful than fear, something ancient, something that didn't belong to this world. I had heard the rumors, the stories, but I had never truly believed them. I never thought they were real. Not until now. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask who they were, but no words escaped. Instead, a vision flashed before my eyes, a blinding image that seared itself into my mind. A great expanse of endless trees, all blackened, their branches twisted and broken. The ground was barren, cracked, as if the earth itself had forgotten how to breathe. In the distance, faint figures moved between the trees, their movements slow, deliberate, as if they were walking through thick mud. I could not see their faces, only their shapes, vague outlines moving against the backdrop of a grey sky that never seemed to change. The air smelled of rot, of decay, and yet no wind stirred. And then I saw them, faces, pale and disfigured, staring at me with empty eyes, their mouths gaping open in silent screams. They reached out toward me, but their hands were as insubstantial as smoke, passing through the air like ghosts that could never quite touch the world of the living. The figure before me spoke again, its voice now a low, guttural rumble, as if it were coming from the very earth itself. They are waiting, just as you will wait, forever. I could feel my blood run cold. The realization struck me like a hammer to the skull. These were the lost, the ones who had wandered into this cursed place before me, the ones who had crossed the line between reality and nightmare, only to become trapped in the hollow place. I tried to move, tried to break free, but it was no use. My body refused to respond. The force that gripped me, that held me in place, was too strong. The figure's smile widened, its teeth sharp and jagged, each one an impossibly long fang. It opened its mouth, but no sound came. Instead, a sickly fog poured from its throat, a dark mist that spiraled upward, consuming everything in its path. I watched, helpless, as the mist thickened, swirling in a violent vortex. The darkness around me seemed to warp and stretch, contorting in impossible shapes. The world was collapsing, folding into itself, the fabric of reality unraveling. You should have stayed away. The words slithered into my ears, but they didn't feel like words. They felt like something much worse, like the final truth of existence, something too horrible to comprehend, too real to deny. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished. The mist dissolved in an instant, and I was left standing in the void, alone. But it wasn't over. No, not yet. The ground beneath me shifted. The earth trembled. A sound, low and guttural, rumbled through the air, coming from all directions. It was the sound of something immense, something ancient, something alive. And then I saw it. A massive shape, impossibly large, rising from the darkness. It was a form without definition, a silhouette of shifting shadows, a shape that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of vision. It was as though the very concept of space was being rewritten around it. Its presence suffocated the air, pushing against me, pressing in from all sides. And from within the depths of that shape, I heard the voices again. Hundreds of voices. Thousands, all speaking at once, a chorus of madness, a tide of whispers that crashed against my mind. Welcome to the end. I closed my eyes, unable to bear the weight of the voices, the sight of the shape looming over me. And as I did, the last shred of hope, of sanity, snapped. It wasn't the darkness that consumed me. It wasn't the shape or the voices. It was the realization that I had already crossed the line, that there was no way back. And then, as the void closed in around me, I understood. I had become one of them, a lost soul,